When Samuel Whitmore bet his last $10 on 100 acres of worthless desert and a neglected horse with two completely gray eyes, everyone in town called him a fool. They stopped laughing the night they discovered what that animal had been guarding for centuries. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust had barely settled on the old barrel when Samuel Whitmore realized his life was about to change forever. He sat in the corner of Dusty Pete's saloon, a weathered establishment that had seen better days, much like Samuel himself. At 62 years old, his hands were calloused from decades of working other people's land, his back permanently curved from bending over crops that would never be his own. The flannel shirt he wore had been patched so many times it was more thread than original fabric, and his boots had holes that let in the cold desert wind. Every night he walked home to his rented shack on the outskirts of town. That evening, Samuel had wandered into the saloon not for the watered-down whiskey or the stale peanuts, but for the warmth. Winter was approaching fast in the high desert of New Mexico, and his small heater had given out 3 days prior. He had exactly $14 to his name, money he had been saving for months to buy seeds for the spring, hoping that maybe this year-old Mr. Patterson would let him work a small plot for himself. It was a foolish dream, he knew, but dreams were all a poor farmer had when the nights grew long and cold. The poker game in the corner caught his attention, not because he intended to play, but because of the commotion surrounding it. A young man in an expensive suit was arguing with an older gentleman whose face was flushed with drink and frustration. The young man, who Samuel would later learn was named Victor Castellano, was the son of a wealthy rancher from the eastern part of the state. He had come west to prove himself, or so he claimed, though his soft hands and polished shoes told a different story. Across from him sat Emmett Hargrove, a man who had once owned one of the largest cattle operations in the region before drink and bad decisions had whittled away his fortune piece by piece. Samuel watched as Emmett slammed his cards on the table, his eyes wild with desperation. The older man had lost everything that night, his remaining cash, his truck, even his watch. All that remained was a deed he had been clutching like a lifeline, a property out in the Chihuahuan desert that nobody wanted. It was 100 acres of nothing, people said, sand and scrub brush and the occasional rattlesnake. There was an old house on it that had been abandoned for years, and according to local legend, the place was cursed. The previous owner had died there under mysterious circumstances, and no one had set foot on the property since. Victor Castellano laughed as Emmett pushed the deed across the table. The young man had no interest in worthless desert land. What would he do with it? He had come to play cards, to feel the thrill of victory, not to collect property that was worth less than the paper it was printed on. He was about to refuse when something caught his eye. Samuel, standing near the bar, watching the scene unfold with quiet interest. Victor's lips curled into a cruel smile. Here was an opportunity for entertainment that money could not buy. "You there," Victor called out, pointing at Samuel. "Old man, you look like someone who could use a change of fortune. What do you say? You want to play a hand for this deed?" Samuel felt every eye in the saloon turn toward him. His heart began to pound in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. He was not a gambling man. He had seen too many lives destroyed by cards and dice, too many families torn apart by the false promise of easy money. But there was something in that moment, a whisper in his ear that seemed to come from nowhere, telling him to step forward. It was as if fate itself had reached down and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I only have $14, Samuel said, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke to anyone these days. Living alone had made him comfortable with silence. Victor laughed again, and several men around the table joined him. $14 for 100 acres. That seems fair, doesn't it, gentlemen?" The sarcasm dripped from his words like honey from a broken jar. "Tell you what, old-timer, make it 10. $10 for the deed. One hand. Winner takes all. Unless you're too scared." Samuel should have walked away. Every rational thought in his mind screamed at him to turn around, to save his money, to return to his cold shack and forget this night had ever happened. but his feet carried him forward as if they had a will of their own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, placing it on the table beside the deed. The paper felt rough against his fingers, real in a way that nothing had felt real in a very long time. Emmett Hargrove, his face a mask of bitter resignation, pushed away from the table and stood. He wanted no part of this final humiliation. He had lost the property fair and square, and now it would pass from one stranger to another while he watched helplessly. Victor shuffled the cards with practiced ease, his eyes never leaving Samuel's weathered face. He was already planning how he would tell this story to his friends back east, the tale of the poor farmer who had thrown away his last $10 on a foolish bet. The cards were dealt. Samuel picked up his hand with trembling fingers, not because he was nervous about losing, but because something deep within him had begun to stir. It was a feeling he could not name, a sense that this moment was somehow significant beyond the simple exchange of money and paper. He looked at his cards and felt his breath catch in his throat. 3 kings stared back at him, their painted faces seeming to wink in the dim light of the saloon. He drew 2 more cards and watched in disbelief as a 4th king joined its brothers, accompanied by an ace of spades. Victor Castellano's smile faded as Samuel laid down his hand. The young man stared at the cards, then at Samuel, then back at the cards again. Around the table, men began to murmur in amazement. 4 kings was a hand that appeared once in a blue moon, the kind of luck that made believers out of skeptics. Victor threw down his own cards in disgust, revealing nothing more than a pair of 7s, and pushed the deed across the table toward Samuel. "Take it," Victor spat. "Take your cursed land. See how lucky you feel when you're out there alone with nothing but sand and ghosts for company." Samuel picked up the deed with hands that had stopped trembling. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. 100 acres in the Chihuahuan Desert, complete with all structures and contents therein. He did not know what awaited him on that land, but as he walked out of the saloon into the cold night air, he felt something he had not felt in decades: hope. Samuel did not sleep that night. He sat in his cold shack, the deed spread out on the small table before him, reading the words over and over again, as if they might disappear if he looked away. The property had belonged to a man named Ezekiel Monroe, according to the faded text, and before that to someone whose name had been scratched out so thoroughly that not even a trace remained. There were notes scribbled in the margins, strange symbols and numbers that Samuel could not decipher, but he paid them little attention. What mattered was that the land was his now, legally and irrevocably. For the first time in his 62 years, Samuel Whitmore owned something. The journey to the property took 3 days. Samuel had no vehicle of his own, so he hitched rides with farmers heading south and walked the stretches in between. The landscape changed gradually as he traveled, the scrubby hills giving way to flat expanses of sand and rock that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the nights brought a cold so sharp it seemed to cut through his worn clothing like a knife. But Samuel pressed on, driven by a determination that surprised even himself. He had spent his entire life working toward nothing, moving from one temporary arrangement to another, always at the mercy of men who'd had more than him. Now he had a destination, a place that belonged to him and him alone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Samuel crested a small rise and saw it for the first time. The property lay before him like a forgotten dream, a patch of desert that looked no different from the miles of emptiness surrounding it. But there in the center stood a house. It was smaller than he had imagined, a simple structure of wood and adobe that had been bleached white by years of sun and wind. The roof sagged in places and several windows were broken, their glass scattered on the ground like fallen stars. Behind the house stood a barn, larger than the dwelling itself, its doors hanging open as if inviting him to explore. Samuel approached slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the scrub brush. He half expected someone to emerge from the house to challenge his presence, but no one appeared. The place was truly abandoned, left to the mercy of the elements for what looked like years. He pushed open the front door, wincing as the hinges screamed in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was covered in a thick layer of dust, but beneath the neglect, Samuel could see that someone had once cared for this place. There was furniture, simple but sturdy, a table and chairs in what served as a kitchen, a bed frame in the back room with a mattress that had been chewed by mice. On the walls hung photographs so faded they were nearly unrecognizable, ghostly images of people who had lived and laughed and loved within these walls. Samuel felt a strange kinship with them, these unknown souls who had tried to make a life in this unforgiving land. He spent an hour exploring the house, taking inventory of what remained. There were tools in a closet, rusted but potentially salvageable. A pump in the kitchen suggested there might be a well nearby. And in a drawer beside the bed, he found a small wooden box containing letters tied with a ribbon that had once been read. Samuel did not read them, feeling that some things deserved their privacy, but he set the box aside carefully. He would give these remnants of a past life the respect they deserved. It was late afternoon when Samuel finally made his way to the barn. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost supernatural in their beauty. The barn doors creaked as he pushed them open, and he stepped into the dim interior, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the shadows. The smell hit him first, a mixture of old hay and something else, something alive. His heart began to race as he realized he was not alone. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the fading light, stood a horse. Samuel froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. The animal was magnificent, a stallion of pure silver-gray coat that seemed to glow even in the darkness. Its mane hung long and tangled, evidence of months or perhaps years without proper care. But beneath the neglect was a creature of extraordinary beauty. The horse stood perfectly still, watching Samuel with an intensity that made the old farmer's breath catch in his throat. But it was the eyes that held him captive. As Samuel stepped closer, moving slowly so as not to startle the animal, he saw that both of the horse's eyes were completely gray. Not the dark brown or gentle blue of most horses, but a pale, silvery gray that seemed to reflect the last light of day like mirrors. They were the most unusual eyes Samuel had ever seen, haunting and beautiful, and somehow knowing, as if the creature could see straight into his soul. "Easy there," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Easy, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." The horse did not move, did not flinch or shy away as Samuel approached. It simply stood there, those remarkable gray eyes fixed on the old man's weathered face, watching and waiting. When Samuel was close enough to reach out and touch its muzzle, the horse lowered its head slightly, a gesture of acceptance that brought unexpected tears to Samuel's eyes. He had worked with animals all his life, had cared for horses and cattle and everything in between. But he had never experienced a connection like this. It was as if the horse had been waiting for him, had known he was coming long before Samuel knew it himself. "You've been here all alone," Samuel murmured, running his hand along the horse's neck. The animal's coat was rough and matted, but beneath his fingers he could feel strong muscles and solid bone. This was no ordinary horse, no work animal left behind by a departing owner. This was something special, something rare. "How long have you been waiting?" The horse made a soft sound, not quite a whinny, more like a sigh of relief. And in that moment, standing in the fading light of a desert sunset, Samuel Whitmore understood that winning this property had been no accident. Fate had brought him here for a reason. The first week on the property tested Samuel in ways he had not anticipated. The house required more work than he had initially thought, with holes in the roof that let in the cold night air and walls that seemed to creak and groan with every gust of wind. But Samuel was no stranger to hard work, and he threw himself into the repairs with a determination born of decades of labor. He patched the roof with materials he salvaged from the barn, replaced broken windows with wooden boards until he could afford glass, and swept out years of accumulated dust and debris. Slowly, gradually, the house began to feel like a home. But it was the horse that occupied most of his thoughts. Samuel had named him Silver, for those remarkable gray eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond human understanding. The animal had been neglected for far too long, his coat matted with burrs and his hooves overgrown to the point of causing pain. Samuel spent hours each day caring for him, brushing out the tangles in his mane, trimming his hooves with tools he sharpened himself, and feeding him whatever he could find. There was little grass on the property, but Samuel discovered a patch of wild oats growing near the old well, and he harvested them carefully, rationing them to make sure Silver had enough to eat. The bond between man and horse grew stronger with each passing day. Silver, who had been wary at first despite his initial acceptance, began to follow Samuel around the property like a faithful dog. When Samuel worked on the house, Silver stood nearby, watching with those pale gray eyes as if supervising the repairs. When Samuel walked the perimeter of his land, exploring the boundaries of his new domain, Silver walked beside him, his hooves falling into rhythm with Samuel's boots. At night, when the temperature dropped and the stars emerged in their millions, Samuel would sit on the porch of his little house, and Silver would stand beside him, the warmth of his body a comfort against the cold. It was during one of these nightly vigils that Samuel first noticed something unusual about Silver's behavior. The moon was full that evening, casting the desert in a pale silver light that made the sand shimmer like water. Samuel was dozing in his chair, half asleep and half awake, when Silver suddenly lifted his head and stared out into the darkness. The horse's entire body had gone rigid, his ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as if he sensed something Samuel could not perceive. "What is it, boy?" Samuel asked, rising from his chair. "What do you see out there?" Silver did not move, did not even acknowledge Samuel's voice. He simply stood there, frozen like a statue, those gray eyes reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that sent a shiver down the old farmer's spine. Samuel followed the horse's gaze, peering out into the desert, but he could see nothing, just sand and scrub brush and the endless expanse of emptiness that surrounded the property on all sides. Then, faintly, Samuel heard it, a sound like rushing water, though there was no water anywhere near this place. The sound grew louder, and with it came a sensation that Samuel could not explain, a feeling of pressure in his chest, as if something heavy was pressing against his heart. Silver stamped his hoof and snorted, and suddenly the sound stopped. The pressure vanished. The night returned to its normal stillness, broken only by the whisper of wind through the brush. Samuel stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He was a practical man, not given to superstition or flights of fancy, but he could not deny what he had experienced. Something had been out there in the darkness, something that Silver had sensed before it arrived and had somehow driven away. The horse turned to look at Samuel, those remarkable eyes seeming to ask a question that the old farmer could not understand. "What are you, Silver?" Samuel murmured, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. "What kind of creature has eyes like yours?" The answer came not from Silver, but from an unexpected visitor who arrived the following morning. Samuel was pumping water from the well when he heard the sound of an engine approaching. He looked up to see a battered pickup truck making its way across the desert toward his property, trailing a cloud of dust behind it. Samuel set down his bucket and waited, his hand instinctively moving to the old knife he kept on his belt. He had not had visitors before, and after the strangeness of the previous night, he was not sure what to expect. The truck pulled to a stop in front of the house, and an old woman climbed out. She was small and weathered, her skin darkened by decades of sun, her hair a shock of white that she wore braided down her back. She wore traditional clothing that marked her as a member of the Apache Nation, and around her neck hung a necklace of turquoise and silver that caught the morning light. Her eyes, dark and sharp, swept across the property before coming to rest on Samuel. "So you are the one," she said, her voice carrying a weight that belied her small frame. "I wondered who would come." Samuel took a step forward, unsure how to respond. "I'm Samuel Whitmore. I won this property in a card game. Can I help you with something?" The old woman did not answer immediately. Her gaze had shifted from Samuel to something behind him, and he turned to see Silver standing there, having emerged from the barn to investigate the visitor. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she made a sound that might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely. She walked past Samuel as if he were not there, approaching the horse with a reverence that made the old farmer's heart pound in his chest. "Moonwalker," she whispered, reaching out to touch Silver's muzzle. The horse, who had been skittish around anyone but Samuel, lowered his head and allowed her touch. "After all these years, you are still here." Samuel watched the encounter with growing confusion and a strange sense of foreboding. "You know this horse? What did you call him?" The old woman turned to face Samuel, and in her dark eyes he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was knowledge, ancient and terrible, the kind of knowledge that changed a person forever once they possessed it. "Moonwalker," she repeated. "The guardian. And you, Samuel Whitmore, have no idea what you have inherited." The old woman's name was Elena Redhawk, and she had been waiting for this moment for nearly 30 years. She sat at Samuel's table, a cup of water in her weathered hands, her eyes drifting occasionally to the window where Silver could be seen grazing on the patch of wild oats. Samuel sat across from her, his heart still pounding from her cryptic words, waiting for an explanation that he both wanted and feared to hear. "This land has a history," Elena began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a story told many times before. "Long before the white men came, long before my own people settled in these valleys, there were others who lived here. They knew things that we have forgotten, secrets of the earth and sky that modern people dismiss as superstition. And they left behind guardians, protectors, who would watch over certain places of power until the right person came to claim them." Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was a practical man, as he had reminded himself many times over the past week, not prone to believing in legends or prophecies. But the events of the previous night, the strange sounds and the pressure in his chest, had shaken his certainty more than he wanted to admit. And there was Silver, the horse with eyes like moonlight, who had behaved in ways that no ordinary animal should. "You're telling me that horse is some kind of spirit?" Samuel asked, trying to keep the skepticism in his voice even as his instincts told him to listen carefully. "A guardian left behind by ancient people?" Elena shook her head slowly. "Not a spirit, not exactly. Moonwalker is flesh and blood, as real as you or me, but he carries within him something more, a purpose that has been passed down through generations. He was born from a line of horses bred specifically for this task, animals chosen for their sensitivity to the unseen world. Those gray eyes are the mark of his bloodline, a sign that he can perceive things that ordinary creatures cannot." Samuel thought of the previous night, of Silver standing rigid on the porch, staring into the darkness at something invisible. He thought of the rushing sound, the pressure in his chest, and the way it had all stopped the moment Silver stamped his hoof. Could it be true? Could this horse possess abilities that defied rational explanation? "What happened to the previous owner?" Samuel asked, remembering the faded photographs in the house, the letters tied with a red ribbon. The deed said his name was Ezekiel Monroe. Elena's expression darkened, and she set down her cup with a soft clink against the wooden table. "Ezekiel was a good man, much like yourself. He came to this land seeking solitude, seeking a place where he could live out his days in peace, and for many years, that is exactly what he found. Moonwalker was young then, barely more than a colt, but Ezekiel recognized his gift immediately. He cared for the horse as you do now, with patience and love, and in return, Moonwalker protected him from the darkness that gathers in places like this." "Darkness?" Samuel repeated, the word sending a chill through his body despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the window. Elena nodded, her eyes meeting Samuel's with an intensity that made him want to look away. "There are thin places in this world, Samuel. Places where the barrier between what we see and what lies beyond grows weak. This property sits on one such place. Most of the time, the barrier holds, and nothing comes through. But sometimes, especially when the moon is full, things try to cross over. Things that do not belong in our world. Things that bring madness and death to those who encounter them." Samuel felt his mouth go dry. He thought of the strange sounds he had heard, the sensation of pressure that had felt like a hand pressing against his heart. Had something been trying to cross over last night? Had Silver somehow stopped it? Ezekiel lived here safely for nearly 20 years, Elena continued. Moonwalker kept the darkness at bay, as his ancestors had done before him. But then Ezekiel grew ill. His body weakened, and he could no longer care for the horse as he once had. He tried to find someone to take over, someone who could continue the work, but the people in town thought he was crazy. They dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a dying man. And when Ezekiel finally passed, Moonwalker was left alone, abandoned to guard this place by himself. Samuel felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He thought of Silver standing in that dark barn, alone and neglected, waiting for someone who would never return. How long had the horse been there? How many nights had he spent fighting back the darkness with no one to care for him, no one to brush his coat or bring him food? That was 3 years ago, Elena said, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. 3 years that Moonwalker has kept watch alone. I came to check on him when I could, bringing food and water. But I am old. I could not care for him as he deserved. I had begun to fear that the bloodline would end, that this place would fall to the darkness forever. She reached across the table and placed her hand on Samuel's, her skin paper-thin, but her grip surprisingly strong. And then you came. A poor farmer who won this land in a card game. Do you still think that was an accident, Samuel? Do you still believe it was luck that brought you here? Samuel looked out the window at Silver, who had raised his head from grazing and was now watching the house with those remarkable gray eyes. The horse seemed to be waiting, patient and eternal, for Samuel to understand what he had become a part of. And slowly, like the dawn breaking over the desert horizon, understanding began to bloom in Samuel's mind. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I help him?" Elena smiled, the first smile Samuel had seen on her weathered face, and it transformed her features from ancient to ageless. "You are already doing it, Samuel. You are caring for him, bonding with him, giving him the strength he needs to fulfill his purpose. But there is more you must learn. The full moon approaches in 2 weeks, and that is when the barrier is weakest. That is when Moonwalker will need you most." She stood from the table, her joints creaking with the effort, and moved toward the door. "I will return before then to teach you what I know, but for now, simply continue what you have been doing. Love him, Samuel. That is the most powerful protection of all." The days following Elena's visit passed in a blur of work and wonder. Samuel threw himself into the task of restoring the property with renewed purpose, understanding now that this land was more than just a place to live. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility that had been passed to him through circumstances that seemed less and less like coincidence with each passing hour. He repaired the barn where Silver slept, reinforcing the walls and replacing the rotted beams with timber he salvaged from an abandoned structure he found at the edge of his property. He cleared the brush around the house, creating a perimeter of open ground that somehow felt safer than the tangled wilderness that had encroached upon it. Silver was his constant companion throughout these labors. The horse seemed to understand that Samuel was working to protect them both, and he helped in whatever ways he could. When Samuel needed to haul materials, Silver allowed himself to be harnessed without complaint, pulling loads that would have taken Samuel hours to move by hand. When Samuel grew tired and sat down to rest, Silver stood beside him, his warm breath a comfort against the old farmer's weathered cheek. And at night, when the darkness gathered and strange sounds echoed across the desert, Silver stood watch on the porch, his gray eyes scanning the shadows for threats that Samuel could not see. It was during one of these evening vigils that Samuel first heard the whispers. He had been dozing in his chair, half asleep and half awake, when a sound like distant voices reached his ears. He sat up straight, his heart pounding, and listened. The voices were too faint to understand, but they seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, from the sand and the rocks and the very air itself. Silver's ears pricked forward, and the horse let out a low sound that might have been a warning or a challenge. Samuel rose from his chair and moved to stand beside Silver, one hand resting on the horse's muscular neck. "What are they saying, boy?" he murmured, though he did not expect an answer. "What do they want?" The whispers grew louder for a moment, and Samuel felt the same pressure in his chest that he had experienced the night before Elena's visit. It was as if something was pushing against him, trying to force its way through a barrier that he could not see. Silver stamped his hoof, and the whispers faded, retreating back into the darkness from which they had come, but Samuel knew they would return. Whatever lurked beyond the barrier was growing bolder, testing the defenses that had kept it at bay for so long. The next morning, Samuel made a decision. He would go to town and learn whatever he could about the history of this property, about Ezekiel Monroe and the people who had lived here before him. Elena had given him some answers, but he sensed there was more to discover, secrets buried in records and memories that might help him understand what he was facing. He saddled Silver with a makeshift harness he had constructed from old leather straps and set out across the desert toward the distant cluster of buildings that passed for civilization in this remote corner of New Mexico. The town of Dry Springs was aptly named. The wells had gone dry decades ago, and the population had dwindled to a handful of stubborn residents who refused to abandon the place where they had been born. Samuel tied Silver outside the general store and walked inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a tired chime. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes and a permanent frown, looked up from behind the counter and studied Samuel with undisguised curiosity. "You're the one who won the Monroe place," the man said. It was not a question. In a town this small, news traveled faster than the wind. "Folks are taking bets on how long you'll last out there." Samuel ignored the provocation. He had dealt with men like this all his life, people who measured others by the size of their wallets and the strength of their backs. "I'm looking for information about the property, about Ezekiel Monroe and anyone who lived there before him." The proprietor's frown deepened, and something that might have been fear flickered in his eyes. "Nothing good ever came from that place, mister. Monroe was a crazy old hermit who talked to himself and believed in nonsense. If you're smart, you'll sell the land to the first buyer who comes along and get yourself somewhere decent to live." Samuel leaned on the counter, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not selling. Now, do you have any records about the property, or should I look elsewhere?" The proprietor hesitated, then jerked his thumb toward a door at the back of the store. "Town records are in there. Help yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." Samuel spent the next 3 hours poring over dusty ledgers and faded documents. What he found confirmed much of what Elena had told him and revealed even more. The property had changed hands many times over the past century, but the pattern was always the same. Someone would buy or inherit the land, live there for a period of years, and then either die or disappear without explanation. The intervals varied, sometimes a decade, sometimes only a few months, but the outcome was always the same. Only Ezekiel Monroe had survived for any significant length of time, and Samuel now understood why. He had been the first owner to recognize Silver's importance, the first to work with the guardian instead of ignoring him. But there was another detail in the records that caught Samuel's attention. According to a survey conducted 50 years ago, the property contained something unusual, a spring that emerged from the ground near the eastern boundary. The water had been described as having peculiar properties, a mineral content unlike anything found in the surrounding region. Several attempts had been made to develop the spring commercially, but all had failed for reasons that the records did not explain. Samuel closed the ledger and sat back in his chair, his mind racing. A spring in the desert was valuable, potentially worth more than the land itself. But if the spring was connected to the thin place that Elena had described, exploiting it could be dangerous. Perhaps that was why every attempt at development had failed. Perhaps the darkness had stopped them. He needed to find that spring. He needed to understand exactly what he had inherited. The search for the spring began the next morning. Samuel woke before dawn, his body stiff from sleeping on the old mattress, but his mind sharp with purpose. Silver was already waiting outside the barn, those remarkable gray eyes reflecting the first pale light of day, as if he somehow knew what Samuel intended to do. The old farmer gathered supplies for the journey, water and dried meat and the worn compass he had found in Ezekiel Monroe's belongings, and set out toward the eastern boundary of his property, with the horse walking steadily beside him. The desert in early morning was a different world from the harsh landscape of midday. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of sage and creosote, and the sky was painted in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise new beginnings. Samuel walked in silence, listening to the crunch of his boots on the sand and the steady rhythm of Silver's hooves. He felt a strange peace in that moment, a sense of rightness that he had not experienced in decades. Whatever waited for him at the spring, he was ready to face it. The eastern boundary of the property was marked by a ridge of low hills, their slopes covered with the same scrub brush that dominated the rest of the landscape. Samuel consulted the old survey map he had copied from the town records and adjusted his course, heading toward a point where two hills came together to form a narrow canyon. According to the map, the spring was located somewhere within that canyon, hidden from casual observation by the surrounding terrain. It was the perfect place for something that did not want to be found. Silver grew increasingly alert as they approached the canyon entrance. His ears swiveled constantly, picking up sounds that Samuel could not hear, and his nostrils flared as if testing the air for danger. The horse did not seem frightened exactly, but there was a tension in his body that had not been present before, a readiness for action that reminded Samuel of his younger days working with cattle dogs. Silver knew something was different about this place, something that demanded caution. The canyon itself was narrow and twisting, its walls rising steeply on either side to block out most of the morning light. Samuel led the way on foot, with Silver following close behind, his breath warm on the old farmer's neck. The silence here was even more profound than in the open desert, a stillness so complete that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. He found himself holding his breath, afraid to disturb whatever ancient presence dwelt in this hidden place. And then he saw it. The spring emerged from a crack in the canyon wall, a thin stream of water that trickled down the rock face and collected in a small pool at the base. The pool was perfectly circular, its surface so still that it reflected the sky above like a mirror. But it was not the shape of the pool that caught Samuel's attention. It was the color. The water was not clear or blue or green, but silver, a pale metallic sheen that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Samuel had never seen anything like it in all his years of working the land. Silver approached the pool slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. He lowered his great head and sniffed at the water, then raised his eyes to meet Samuel's gaze. There was something in that look, a question or perhaps a permission, that made the old farmer's heart race. He knelt beside the pool and reached out with trembling fingers, hesitating just above the surface. The air above the water was warm, almost hot, despite the coolness of the canyon, and Samuel could feel a subtle vibration passing through his hand, as if the spring itself was alive and breathing. When his fingers finally touched the water, Samuel gasped. Images flooded his mind, visions that came too fast to comprehend, flashes of light and darkness and faces he did not recognize. He saw this canyon as it had been centuries ago, when people in strange garments had gathered around the pool to perform rituals he could not understand. He saw Silver, or a horse very much like him, standing guard at the canyon entrance, those gray eyes watching the proceedings with ancient wisdom. And he saw something else, a shape in the darkness beyond the pool, a presence that had no form but radiated hunger and malice like heat from a fire. Samuel jerked his hand back, breaking the connection, and stumbled away from the pool. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples, and his breath came in ragged gasps that echoed off the canyon walls. Silver moved to stand beside him, pressing his warm body against Samuel's side, offering comfort and stability in the wake of the overwhelming visions. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. When Samuel finally found his voice, it came out as a croak. "That's what's trying to get through, isn't it? That thing I saw in the darkness." Silver bobbed his head once, a gesture that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. The horse understood. He had always understood, passed down through generations of guardians who had kept watch over this place since before memory. The spring was not just a source of water. It was a doorway, a thin place where the barrier between worlds grew weak enough for things to pass through. and Silver's bloodline had been bred specifically to guard that doorway, to keep the darkness from spilling into the world of light. Samuel looked at the pool again, at its silver surface that reflected nothing now but the sky above. He understood now why every attempt to develop the spring had failed. The people who had tried had not known what they were dealing with, had not understood that some things were meant to be protected, not exploited. But he understood, and with understanding came responsibility. "I won't let anything happen to this place," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke the words aloud. "I'll protect it, just like Ezekiel did, just like you and your ancestors have done for all these years." Silver turned those remarkable gray eyes toward Samuel, and in their depths, the old farmer saw something that looked very much like gratitude. They stood together in the hidden canyon, man and horse, guardians of a secret that the world had forgotten. The full moon was approaching, and with it would come the greatest test of their bond. But in that moment, Samuel felt no fear. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Elena returned 3 days before the full moon, just as she had promised. Samuel saw her truck approaching from miles away, a plume of dust rising against the pale morning sky like a signal fire. He had been counting the days since her first visit, marking them on the wall of his little house with charcoal scratches that reminded him of a prisoner tracking time in a cell. But Samuel was not a prisoner. He was a guardian now, and the marks on the wall were not counting down to release, but to confrontation. The old woman climbed out of her truck with more energy than Samuel had expected. She carried a leather bag over her shoulder, worn soft by decades of use, and her eyes immediately sought out Silver, who stood watching from the shade of the barn. A smile crossed her weathered face when she saw the horse, a smile that seemed to take years off her appearance and reveal the vibrant woman she must once have been. "He looks stronger," Elena observed, walking toward Samuel with the easy gait of someone who had spent her life traversing difficult terrain. "You have been caring for him well. The bond between you grows deeper every day." Samuel nodded, accepting the compliment without false modesty. He had worked hard to restore Silver's health, and the results were visible in the horse's gleaming coat and alert posture. But there was more to their bond than physical care. In the weeks since Samuel had arrived, he and Silver had developed an understanding that transcended words, a connection built on trust and mutual respect. When Samuel woke in the night with the whispers pressing against his mind, Silver was always there, standing watch outside his window. When Silver grew restless and paced the perimeter of the property, Samuel walked beside him, lending his human presence to the horse's vigilance. "I found the spring," Samuel said as Elena reached his side. "I touched the water and saw things, visions of the past, of the people who used to gather there, and something else, something in the darkness." Elena's smile faded, replaced by an expression of grave concern. "You should not have touched the water, Samuel, not without proper preparation. The spring is a conduit, a channel between worlds. Those who touch it without protection risk drawing the attention of what waits on the other side." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. "Did I do something wrong? Did I make things worse?" The old woman considered his question for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps, or perhaps it was necessary. The bond between guardian and land must be sealed with knowledge, and knowledge often comes at a price. What matters now is what you do with what you have learned." She led Samuel to the porch of his house and sat down on the steps, patting the space beside her in invitation. Silver wandered over to join them, standing close enough that Samuel could feel the warmth of his body. Elena opened her leather bag and began removing objects, laying them out on the wooden planks with the care of a priest arranging sacred implements on an altar. There were stones of various colors and sizes, some polished smooth and others rough and natural. There were bundles of dried herbs tied with string, their scent sharp and unfamiliar. There was a small drum painted with symbols that Samuel did not recognize, and a knife with a handle carved from bone, and there was a necklace, similar to the one Elena wore, fashioned from turquoise and silver in a pattern that seemed to shift and change when Samuel looked at it directly. "These are the tools of protection," Elena explained, touching each object in turn. "They have been passed down through my family for generations, kept safe for the day when they would be needed again. The stones mark the boundaries of sacred space. The herbs purify and ward against evil. The drum calls upon the spirits of our ancestors for guidance. The knife is for sacrifice, though blood is rarely required. Samuel listened carefully, committing every word to memory. He had never been a religious man, had never put much stock in rituals or ceremonies, but he understood that some knowledge could not be gained from books or experience. Some things had to be taught, passed from one keeper to another in an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. "And the necklace?" he asked, pointing to the last object on the steps. Elena picked it up and held it out to Samuel, the turquoise catching the light and seeming to glow from within. "This is for you. It was made for the guardian of this place, crafted by my grandmother from materials gathered at the spring itself. It will protect you from the worst of what you will face, though it cannot make you invincible. Nothing can do that." Samuel took the necklace with trembling hands. The weight of it surprised him, heavier than it looked, as if it carried the burden of all the years it had waited for this moment. He slipped it over his head and felt it settle against his chest, cool at first but quickly warming to match the temperature of his skin. For a moment, nothing seemed different. Then Samuel became aware of a subtle change in his perception, as if a film had been lifted from his eyes. The colors of the world seemed brighter, the sounds sharper, and he could sense Silver's presence beside him, not just as a physical form, but as a force, a pillar of light and strength that anchored him to the earth. "Now you see as Moonwalker sees," Elena said, watching Samuel's reaction with knowing eyes. "Now you understand why he was chosen for this task. His perception has always extended beyond the visible world, into the realm where light and darkness wage their eternal war. With the necklace, you share that perception. You will be able to fight alongside him when the full moon rises." Samuel looked at Silver, seeing the horse now in a new way. The gray eyes that had always seemed remarkable were now revealed as windows into another dimension, portals through which Silver perceived threats that ordinary creatures could never detect. The horse met Samuel's gaze and held it, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them that went beyond anything Samuel had experienced before. They were ready, or as ready as they would ever be. The full moon rose over the desert like a silver coin pressed against black velvet. Samuel stood on the porch of his little house, the turquoise necklace warm against his chest, watching the light spread across the sand and transform the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The temperature had dropped sharply with sunset, and his breath formed small clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating into nothing. Beside him, Silver stood motionless, those remarkable gray eyes fixed on the horizon where the moon continued its slow ascent into the heavens. Elena had left that morning, despite Samuel's protest that she should stay and help. She had shaken her head with the patience of someone who had explained difficult truths many times before. This was not her fight, she told him. The bond between guardian and protector was sacred, and the presence of a third party would only weaken it. She had taught Samuel everything she could in the short time they had together, had shown him how to use the stones and herbs and drum, had explained the words of power that his ancestors had never known, but that his soul would recognize when the moment came. Now the rest was up to him. Samuel had spent the day preparing. He had placed the colored stones at intervals around the house, forming a circle that Elena assured him would hold against all but the most powerful intrusions. He had burned the dried herbs in a small fire, walking the perimeter of the property and letting the smoke drift across the boundaries of his land. He had even practiced with the bone-handled knife, though Elena had been unclear about exactly what he might need to cut. The preparations had kept his hands busy and his mind focused, preventing the fear that lurked at the edges of his consciousness from taking hold. Now, with the moon risen and the darkness gathering, Samuel felt that fear pressing against his defenses like water against a dam. He had faced many challenges in his 62 years, had weathered droughts and floods and the casual cruelty of men who had more power than compassion. But he had never faced anything like this. He had never stood against a force that existed beyond the boundaries of the natural world, a hunger that had waited centuries for its chance to break through. Silver moved first, stepping off the porch and walking toward the eastern boundary of the property where the hidden canyon lay. Samuel followed without hesitation, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own. The moonlight was bright enough to see by, casting sharp shadows across the sand, and making every rock and bush seem larger and more ominous than it had during the day. The whispers started before they had gone 100 yards, soft at first but growing louder with each step, voices speaking words in a language that Samuel did not recognize but somehow understood. They were hungry. They had been waiting so long, and tonight the door would finally open. Samuel felt the pressure building in his chest, stronger than it had ever been before. It was as if invisible hands were pressing against him from all sides, trying to squeeze the breath from his lungs and the courage from his heart. He stumbled, nearly falling, and Silver immediately moved to his side, pressing his warm flank against Samuel's body. The contact broke through the pressure somehow, created a bubble of clarity in which Samuel could breathe and think and remember why he was here. They reached the entrance to the canyon just as the moon reached its highest point. The silver light poured down between the walls like liquid, illuminating the path ahead with an otherworldly glow. Samuel could see the spring at the far end, its metallic surface reflecting the moon in a perfect circle that seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm. And he could see something else, a darkness gathering around the edges of the pool, a shadow that moved and writhed despite the absence of any physical form to cast it. Silver let out a sound that was not quite a whinny and not quite a scream. It was a challenge, ancient and primal, a declaration of intent that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. The darkness paused in its writhing, and Samuel had the distinct impression that it was looking at them, assessing the threat they represented. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the shadow surged forward, pouring over the edge of the pool, like oil spreading across water. Samuel raised the drum that Elena had given him and began to beat it in the rhythm she had taught him. The sound was surprisingly powerful, each strike resonating through the canyon like thunder, pushing back against the advancing darkness. Silver moved to stand between Samuel and the shadow, those gray eyes blazing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. The horse's hooves struck the ground in time with the drum, adding their own percussion to the rhythm of resistance. The darkness recoiled, and for a moment Samuel dared to hope that it would be this easy. But the shadow was only regrouping, gathering its strength for another assault. It surged forward again, faster this time, tendrils of pure blackness reaching toward Silver like grasping fingers. One of them connected with the horse's flank, and Silver screamed, a sound of pure agony that tore at Samuel's heart. Without thinking, Samuel dropped the drum and pulled the bone-handled knife from his belt. He ran toward Silver, placing himself between the horse and the shadow, and slashed at the tendril that had attached itself to his friend. The blade passed through the darkness without resistance, but where it cut, the shadow dissolved, breaking apart into wisps that faded into the moonlight. Samuel slashed again and again, driving back the tendrils that reached for them both. But the shadow was vast, far larger than anything Samuel had imagined. For every tendril he severed, two more appeared. The pressure in his chest returned, stronger than before, and he felt his strength beginning to fade. Beside him, Silver was struggling to stay upright, the wound on his flank oozing blood that looked black in the moonlight. They were losing. Despite all their preparation, despite the bond they had forged, they were not enough. Then Samuel remembered Elena's final words, spoken as she climbed into her truck that morning. "The greatest weapon is not the knife or the drum," she had said. "It is the love that binds guardian to protector. That is what they cannot overcome." Samuel dropped the knife and wrapped his arms around Silver's neck, pressing his face against the horse's warm coat. He closed his eyes and thought of everything they had shared, every moment of connection, every silent understanding that had passed between them. He poured all of his love, all of his gratitude, all of his fierce determination to protect this magnificent creature into that embrace. And the darkness screamed. The scream that tore through the canyon was unlike anything Samuel had ever heard. It was not a sound that belonged to the physical world, not a vibration of air molecules striking eardrums, but something far more profound. It was the cry of something ancient and hungry, confronting a force it had never expected to encounter, a power that defied all its centuries of patient waiting. The darkness that had been surging toward them froze in place, its tendrils retracting like the limbs of a wounded spider, and in that moment of hesitation, everything changed. Light exploded from the point where Samuel and Silver stood embraced. It poured from the turquoise necklace against Samuel's chest, from Silver's remarkable gray eyes, from the very bond that connected man and horse in a chain of love and loyalty that transcended the boundaries between species. The light was not harsh or blinding, but warm and soft, the color of moonlight filtered through clouds, the color of hope in the darkest hour. It spread outward in a wave, washing over the canyon walls, filling every shadow with its gentle radiance. The darkness fought back with everything it had. Tendrils lashed out wildly, trying to pierce the expanding sphere of light, but wherever they touched, they dissolved into wisps of nothing. The shadow's scream rose in pitch, becoming a shriek of rage and frustration that seemed to shake the very stones beneath Samuel's feet. He held on to Silver with all his strength, refusing to let go, refusing to break the connection that was their only weapon against this ancient evil. Samuel felt the horse trembling against him, felt the warm blood from Silver's wound soaking into his shirt. The battle was taking its toll on both of them, draining their strength with every passing second. But Samuel also felt something else, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the necklace or the light or any external force. It was the warmth of purpose, of knowing beyond any doubt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The light continued to expand, pushing the darkness back toward the pool from which it had emerged. Samuel opened his eyes and watched as the shadow retreated, its formless mass shrinking and condensing as it was forced toward the thin place between worlds. Silver raised his great head and let out a sound that was not a scream this time, but a call, a summons that seemed to reach beyond the physical canyon and into realms that Samuel could barely perceive. And from those realms, something answered. They came like whispers of wind, like memories of dreams, like the faint echoes of hoofbeats on ancient stone. The spirits of Silver's ancestors, the guardians who had watched over this place for generations beyond counting, emerged from the light itself. Samuel could not see them clearly, could only perceive their presence as shapes of luminescence that moved with purpose and power. They surrounded the retreating darkness, forming a barrier that drove it inexorably toward the silver pool. One by one, the ancestral spirits added their strength to Silver's, their light merging with his until the canyon blazed with an illumination that rivaled the sun. The darkness, overwhelmed and outmatched, began to collapse in on itself, its tendrils withering and its mass shrinking with every heartbeat. Samuel watched in awe as centuries of patient waiting, of hungry longing, of malevolent intent were undone in a matter of moments. With a final shriek that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself, the darkness plunged back into the silver pool. The water churned and bubbled for several seconds, then grew still. The light that had filled the canyon began to fade, the ancestral spirits dissolving back into whatever realm they had come from, their task complete. And Samuel found himself standing in ordinary moonlight once more, his arms still wrapped around Silver's neck, his heart pounding with the aftermath of what they had accomplished. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Samuel was afraid to let go, afraid that if he released Silver, he would discover that the victory had been an illusion, that the darkness was still lurking just beyond the edge of perception. But gradually, as the silence of the canyon settled around them and nothing stirred in the shadows, he allowed his arms to loosen. He stepped back and looked at Silver, really looked at him, and what he saw brought tears to his eyes. The wound on Silver's flank was closing before his very eyes, the torn flesh knitting itself back together with a speed that defied all natural law. The horse's coat, which had been matted with blood and sweat, was now clean and gleaming, reflecting the moonlight like polished silver. And those remarkable gray eyes, those windows into another dimension, were brighter than Samuel had ever seen them, filled with a peace and contentment that seemed to radiate outward and fill the entire canyon. Samuel sank to his knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. He had never experienced anything like this, had never imagined that such things were possible. He was just a poor farmer who had won a worthless property in a card game, a man who had spent his entire life struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to grind him down. And yet here he was, a guardian of ancient secrets, a protector of the barrier between worlds, bonded to a creature whose lineage stretched back to the dawn of time. Silver lowered his great head and nuzzled Samuel's shoulder, a gesture of affection and gratitude that needed no words. Samuel reached up and stroked the horse's muzzle, feeling the soft warmth of his breath against his palm. They had done it. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The spring was sealed, the barrier restored, and whatever had waited so long for its chance to break through was now trapped once more in the realm from which it had come. Samuel did not know how long they stayed there in the canyon, man and horse, recovering from their ordeal. But when he finally rose to his feet and began the long walk back to the house, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. He had been changed by this night, transformed in ways that he was only beginning to understand. And as they walked together through the moonlit desert, Samuel realized that the true value of what he had won in that card game was only now becoming clear. The $10 he had bet was the best investment he had ever made. The years that followed the night of the full moon brought changes that Samuel could never have predicted. Word of his property spread slowly at first, carried by Elena to members of her community who understood the significance of what lay hidden in the desert. They came to visit, these keepers of ancient knowledge, bringing gifts of food and tools and wisdom that they shared freely with the old farmer who had become one of them. Samuel welcomed each visitor with the hospitality that had been bred into him by a lifetime of humility, and in return, he received something far more valuable than any material possession. He received belonging. The spring in the hidden canyon, once a source of danger and fear, became something else entirely after the darkness was defeated. The silver water that had pulsed with otherworldly power now flowed clear and pure, its strange properties transformed by the sealing of the barrier. Elena explained that this was the way of thin places. When properly guarded, they became sources of blessing rather than curse. The water from the spring had healing properties, she told Samuel, capable of curing ailments that modern medicine could not touch. Word of this miracle spread through the communities that trusted Elena, and soon people began making pilgrimages to Samuel's property, seeking relief from suffering that had seemed endless. Samuel never charged for access to the spring. The very idea seemed wrong to him, a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in his hands. But the pilgrims who came brought gifts of their own, contributions that slowly transformed the humble property into something more. A new roof appeared on the house, then new windows, then a proper kitchen with running water. The barn was expanded and reinforced, becoming a stable fit for the remarkable horse who had saved Samuel's life. Gardens were planted and tended by visitors who wanted to give back, and soon the once barren desert bloomed with vegetables and flowers that should not have been able to grow in such harsh conditions. Silver thrived in this new environment, his coat growing thick and lustrous, his eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed to deepen with each passing season. The horse became a legend among those who visited the property, a living symbol of the bond between the physical and spiritual worlds. Children who came with their parents would spend hours in his presence, and Samuel noticed that they often left changed, their eyes holding a wisdom that had not been there before. Silver had a gift for touching souls, for awakening something dormant in those who opened themselves to his presence. The full moon continued to rise each month, but the darkness never returned. Samuel and Silver still kept their vigil on those nights, walking the perimeter of the property together, maintaining the watch that had been passed down through generations. But the whispers that had once pressed against Samuel's mind were silent now, replaced by a peace that settled over the land like a blessing. The barrier held, strengthened by love and loyalty, and the ancient evil that had hungered for so long was forced to wait in vain. Elena visited often, her weathered face always breaking into a smile when she saw how the property had transformed. She and Samuel would sit on the porch in the evenings, sharing stories and silences while Silver grazed nearby. On one such evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elena turned to Samuel with an expression of deep contentment. "Do you remember what Victor Castellano said to you that night in the saloon?" she asked, her voice soft with memory. "He told you to see how lucky you felt when you were out here alone with nothing but the sand and ghosts for company." Samuel nodded, remembering the young man's cruel smile, his casual dismissal of the property that had become Samuel's entire world. "I remember. He thought I was a fool." Elena laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "And yet here you are, surrounded by friends who love you, guardian of a sacred place, bonded to a creature worth more than all the gold in the world. Tell me, Samuel, do you feel like a fool?" Samuel looked out at his property, at the house that had become a home, at the gardens that fed both body and spirit, at Silver standing noble and proud in the fading light. He thought about the $10 he had bet on that distant night, the last of his savings, money he had been too poor to lose. He thought about the path that single decision had set him on, the journey from poverty and loneliness to abundance and connection. "I feel like the luckiest man alive," he said, and meant every word. The story of Samuel Whitmore and his gray-eyed horse spread far beyond the communities that visited the spring. It became a legend whispered around campfires and kitchen tables, a tale of how the poorest among us can inherit riches beyond measure if they only have the courage to accept what fate offers. People who heard the story were inspired to take chances they might otherwise have avoided, to open their hearts to possibilities that seemed too good to be true. And in the high desert of New Mexico, on 100 acres of land that had once been considered worthless, an old farmer and his extraordinary horse continued their watch. They walked together at dawn and dusk, guardian and protector, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The property that Samuel had won for $10 proved to be worth more than he could have ever imagined, not because of the healing spring or the fertile gardens or the pilgrims who came seeking miracles, but because of what it had given him that money could never buy. It had given him purpose. It had given him family. It had given him Silver, the horse with the two completely gray eyes, whose value was measured not in dollars, but in love. And on quiet evenings, when the moon rose full and silver over the desert, Samuel would sit on his porch with his hand resting on Silver's neck, listening to the whisper of wind through the scrub brush, and know that he was exactly where he belonged. The poor farmer who had risked everything on a $10 bet had found something worth more than all the wealth in the world. He had found home,